The early summer of 1996 arrived in northeastern Wyoming with a peculiar heaviness that longtime residents couldn't quite explain. By late June, the heat pressed down on the grasslands near Lake Alturas, with an intensity that made the air shimmer above the two-lane highway leading to Camp Riverside, a modest overnight facility that had served the region's youth for nearly 40 years. 12 teenagers from Casper's Lincoln High School had boarded a refurbished school bus on June 23rd, excited for a week of canoeing, hiking, and freedom from the watchful eyes of parents. The driver, a 47-year-old veteran named Russell Vance, had made the journey dozens of times. The camp director, 62-year-old Diane Kruger, waited at the gates with clipboard in hand, checking her watch as the afternoon stretched toward evening. The bus never arrived. Before we continue with this story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's get back to what happened that summer day. The first alarm came from Diane herself, who called the Lincoln High School office at 7:15 that evening. The secretary, already locking up for the weekend, felt her stomach drop as Diane's voice trembled through the receiver. Russell Vance was punctual to a fault, she explained, a man who arrived early to everything. The route from Casper to Lake Alturas followed Highway 220 for 60 miles before turning onto County Road 47, a stretch of cracked asphalt that wound through ranchland, where cell phone service flickered in and out like a dying light bulb. By 8 o'clock, Diane had driven the entire route herself, scanning the shoulders and turnoffs for any sign of the distinctive yellow bus with its painted blue stripe. She found nothing, not even tire marks veering off the road. The Natrona County Sheriff's Department launched a search operation that same night, deploying every available deputy and volunteer. Parents gathered in the high school gymnasium, holding photographs of their children and demanding answers that nobody could provide. Among them were Patricia and Ronald Fletcher, whose 15-year-old daughter Kimberly had been looking forward to the camp for months. Next to them sat the Delgado family, parents of twin brothers Victor and Luis, both 14, who had saved their allowances to buy new fishing rods for the trip. The Zimmerman family drove in from their ranch 30 miles outside Casper, desperate for news of their son Daniel, a quiet 16-year-old who rarely left the property except for school. Altogether, 12 families waited as dawn broke over the gymnasium's fluorescent lights, their exhaustion turning to dread with each passing hour. Helicopters swept over the route for 3 consecutive days, pilots straining their eyes against the glare of sun on metal, searching for the reflection of a yellow roof. Dive teams were dispatched to the handful of water crossings along County Road 47, dragging the shallow depths of irrigation channels and cattle ponds. The sheriff organized ground searches that covered 100 square miles of empty prairie, volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder through grass that reached their waists. Russell Vance's wife, Helen, appeared on local news broadcasts, her hands shaking as she held up a photograph of her husband in his bus driver's uniform. She described him as methodical, responsible, someone who checked his mirrors compulsively and never exceeded the speed limit. The notion that he had simply driven off course seemed impossible to everyone who knew him. By the second week, national media descended on Casper. The story had everything that captured the public's morbid fascination. Innocent children, a mysterious vanishing, a landscape vast enough to swallow evidence whole. Investigators from the FBI joined the local effort, bringing cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar equipment. They interviewed every resident along the route, cataloging suspicions and rumors that led nowhere. One rancher reported seeing a yellow vehicle heading south on an unmarked dirt road around 4:30 that afternoon, but the direction made no sense given the camp's location to the northwest. Another witness claimed to have spotted the bus parked near an abandoned grain elevator 15 miles east of the highway. But when deputies investigated, they found only rusted farm equipment and nesting birds. The leads dissolved like morning frost. Lake Alturas itself became a focal point of the investigation in mid-July, when a volunteer diver noticed unusual disturbances in the sediment near the northwestern shore. The lake, a reservoir created in 1967 by damming the North Platte River, covered approximately 2,000 acres at full capacity. Its deepest sections reached nearly 80 feet, and over the decades it had claimed the lives of 3 recreational swimmers and 1 fishing boat that capsized during a summer storm. Sonar equipment revealed dozens of objects resting on the lakebed, most of them tree stumps and boulders from the valley that had been flooded during the dam's construction. But one signature stood out: a large, rectangular shape approximately 30 feet long, resting at a depth of 62 feet in an area rarely visited by boaters. The dive team descended on July 18, 1996, their lights cutting through the murky water as they approached the object. What they found defied all predictions. It was indeed a bus, resting upright on the lakebed as if it had been carefully parked there. The yellow paint had already begun to fade, and algae covered the windows in thick green curtains. Through the murk, divers could make out the painted blue stripe that matched the description of Russell Vance's vehicle, but the recovery operation, which began immediately, revealed something that turned the investigation on its head. The bus was completely empty. No bodies, no personal belongings, no luggage or camping equipment. The seats showed no signs of struggle or panic. The emergency exit at the rear remained closed from the inside. Most puzzling of all, both the front door and the rear emergency door were shut tight, their mechanisms engaged as if the bus had been sealed deliberately before its descent into the water. Forensic teams spent weeks examining every inch of the recovered bus. They found Russell Vance's logbook in the driver's seat, entries detailing routine maintenance and fuel stops, the final notation made on the morning of June 23rd at a gas station in Casper. Fingerprints throughout the interior matched those of the missing students and the driver, but offered no clues about what had happened. The bus's mechanical systems were intact, showing no signs of brake failure or steering malfunction that might explain an accidental plunge into the lake. The fuel tank still held diesel, enough to have completed the journey to Camp Riverside twice over. Investigators measured the distance from the nearest road to the lake's edge, 300 yards of rough terrain, dense with sagebrush and scattered boulders, utterly impassable for a vehicle of that size. Yet somehow the bus had ended up submerged in deep water, miles from any boat ramp or access point. The case consumed the investigators and the families for the remainder of that year. Theories multiplied like weeds. Abduction by an organized group capable of disposing of a bus and 12 people without a trace. A catastrophic accident followed by a cover-up. Even speculation about clandestine military operations in the region. Though the nearest installation lay over 100 miles to the south, Patricia Fletcher became the unofficial spokesperson for the families, appearing on every talk show and news program that would have her, pleading for information. She established a tip line that received thousands of calls, each one chased down by volunteers who wanted desperately to find the children alive. But as autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, the hope that had sustained them began to curdle into grief without closure. By 1998, the active investigation had been scaled back to a cold case unit, a single detective assigned to review tips and follow up on occasional leads. The families held annual vigils at Lake Alturas, gathering on the anniversary of the disappearance to release balloons and share memories of children who would forever remain 15, 14, 16. Daniel Zimmerman's mother died in 2003, her obituary noting that she passed away from a broken heart, never having learned what happened to her son. The Delgado twins' father sold the family's auto repair shop and moved to Arizona, unable to bear the sight of the high school his sons would never graduate from. Kimberly Fletcher's photograph remained on her parents' mantel, a young girl frozen in time with a smile that promised a future she never received. The drought began in earnest in 2018, part of a larger pattern of aridification that gripped the western United States with unprecedented severity. Lake Alturas, like reservoirs throughout the region, began to shrink as snowpack in the mountains diminished and temperatures climbed year after year. By the summer of 2020, the waterline had receded 40 feet from its historical average, exposing mudflats and long submerged shoreline. Fishermen discovered the remains of old camping sites and discarded beer cans from decades past. The lake's recreational use declined as boat ramps led to dry land and marinas sat high and dry. Local news ran occasional stories about the drought's impact, interviewing worried ranchers and municipal water managers, but the broader public paid little attention until the discovery that changed everything. On the morning of September 12, 2020, a father and son from Casper launched their small fishing boat from one of the few remaining accessible points on Lake Alturas. The son, 19-year-old Jacob Patterson, had heard stories about the 1996 disappearance from his high school history teacher, but it felt like ancient history, something from before he was born. His father, William, remembered the case clearly. He had been a volunteer in the original search efforts, walking the prairie for 3 days in the brutal June heat. They motored slowly across the diminished lake, searching for deeper pockets where fish might congregate, when Jacob noticed something breaking the surface about 200 yards from where the old northwestern shore would have been. At first, he thought it was a partially submerged log, but as they approached, the shape resolved into something far more unsettling. The top corner of a yellow bus roof exposed to the sunlight for the first time in 24 years. William called the sheriff's department immediately, his voice shaking as he tried to explain what they had found. Within hours, deputies had cordoned off the area and divers were in the water, their excitement tempered by the knowledge that they were disturbing what was essentially a mass grave, or should have been. But as they circled the partially exposed vehicle, running their hands along its algae-covered surface, they made an observation that sent a chill through the entire team. This was not the same bus that had been recovered in 1996. The placement was different, resting in shallower water about 50 yards from where the first vehicle had been found. More importantly, this bus bore a different identification number stenciled on its rear panel. And when the divers peered through the windows, their flashlight beams revealed something that defied all logical explanation. The interior was also empty, but the rear emergency door stood wide open, its hinges frozen in place, as if someone had exited the vehicle before it sank. The recovery operation began the following day, using the same crane barge that had lifted the first bus from the lakebed 24 years earlier. A crowd gathered on the shore, drawn by news helicopters and social media posts that had transformed the discovery into a macabre spectacle. Among the onlookers stood Patricia Fletcher, now 68 years old, her face lined with decades of unanswered questions. She had driven from her home in Denver, where she had moved after her marriage dissolved under the weight of grief. Next to her stood Victor Delgado's daughter, a young woman who had never met her uncle but had grown up hearing stories about the twin boys who vanished when her father was 14. A coincidence of names, Victor had named his only child Victoria in memory of his lost brother. As the bus broke the surface of the lake, water streaming from its open windows and emergency exit, investigators immediately noticed details that complicated the timeline they thought they understood. This vehicle was older than the first, a model from the late 1980s rather than the mid-90s. Its yellow paint had faded almost to white, and the blue stripe was thinner, painted in a slightly different shade. The front license plate, crusted with mineral deposits, showed an expired registration from 1989. Inside, forensic teams found waterlogged maps of Wyoming, a thermos still wedged in the cup holder beside the driver's seat, and a laminated camp roster clipped to the sun visor. The names on that roster made investigators' blood run cold. 12 teenagers from Casper scheduled to attend Camp Riverside in the summer of 1989, 7 years before Russell Vance and his passengers disappeared. The revelation that there had been an earlier disappearance, one that had somehow been forgotten or overlooked, sent investigators scrambling through archived records. What they discovered was a bureaucratic nightmare of lost paperwork and jurisdictional confusion. In late June of 1989, a private camp bus operated by a company called High Plains Youth Services had indeed been reported missing en route to Lake Alturas. But the case had been handled by a different county due to boundary disputes about where the bus had last been seen, and in the chaos of jurisdictional transfers, the investigation had stalled out within weeks. The families of those 12 children had been told that the bus had likely continued to a different state, perhaps Colorado or Montana, based on a single, unverified sighting. When no bodies turned up and no evidence of foul play emerged, the case had been quietly shelved and eventually lost in a records purge during the transition to digital filing systems in the early 2000s. Now, with 2 buses recovered from the same lake, investigators faced a terrifying pattern. Both vehicles had carried 12 teenagers from Casper to Camp Riverside. Both had vanished without a trace on their respective June journeys, 7 years apart. Both had been found empty, their passengers seemingly evaporated into thin air. The open emergency door on the second bus suggested that someone had exited the vehicle. But where had they gone? The lake in 1989 had been just as deep and isolated as it was in 1996. There were no structures nearby, no boats reported missing, no sightings of wet, traumatized teenagers stumbling through the prairie. The forensic teams found no bodies in the surrounding lakebed, no bones scattered by currents or scavengers. It was as if 24 people had simply ceased to exist at the moment their buses entered the water. The investigation that followed dwarfed the original 1996 effort. Federal agents combed through every record associated with Camp Riverside, interviewing former counselors and directors, examining financial records for any hint of criminal activity. They discovered that Diane Kruger, the camp director who had reported the first disappearance, had died in 2011, taking whatever knowledge she might have had to her grave. Russell Vance's widow Helen was tracked down to a nursing home in Montana, her memory too deteriorated to offer any new insights. The driver of the 1989 bus, a man named Carl Peterson, had died in a car accident in 1993, another dead end in a case full of them. Desperate for answers, investigators began to focus on the lake itself. They commissioned a comprehensive sonar survey of the entire lakebed, searching for additional vehicles or evidence that might explain the pattern. What they found instead was a geological anomaly, a series of underwater sinkholes and caves along the northern shore created by the dissolution of subsurface gypsum deposits. These voids, some of them large enough to swallow a car, had formed naturally over millennia, but had been flooded and obscured when the reservoir was created in 1967. Could the buses have somehow been driven or pushed into these sinkholes, sinking quickly into depths that the original search teams had never explored? The theory had holes. It didn't explain how the buses got to the lake in the first place or where the passengers had gone, but it offered at least a geological framework for the vehicle's placement. Patricia Fletcher watched these developments from her Denver home, following every news update with an intensity that worried her physician. She'd spent 24 years constructing elaborate theories about what might have happened to Kimberly, scenarios ranging from trafficking rings to witness protection programs. The discovery of the second bus shattered all of those comfortable fictions and replaced them with something far more disturbing: the possibility that her daughter's disappearance had been part of a pattern, a deliberate series of events orchestrated by someone with knowledge of both Camp Riverside and Lake Alturas. But who would want to abduct 24 teenagers across 2 separate incidents? And why had no demands ever been made, no bodies ever surfaced? In October of 2020, a retired FBI profiler named Catherine Reeves volunteered to review the case files. Reeves had spent 30 years analyzing patterns in serial crimes, and something about the Lake Alturas disappearances nagged at her sense of professional intuition. She spent 6 weeks in a Casper hotel room, surrounded by boxes of documents, photographs, and evidence logs. What emerged from her analysis was a theory that local law enforcement found both compelling and impossible to prove. She believed that someone with intimate knowledge of the camp's operations and the lake's geography had deliberately targeted these buses, using the remote location and the jurisdictional confusion between counties to ensure that the disappearances would never be properly investigated. Reeves pointed to specific details that suggested planning and foreknowledge. Both buses had disappeared on Sunday afternoons in late June, when traffic on County Road 47 was minimal and the camp was between sessions. Both had carried exactly 12 passengers, the maximum that Camp Riverside could accommodate in its smaller cabins. Both had been driven by men who lived alone and had no close family to immediately raise alarms. The probability of these similarities occurring by chance was astronomically small. Reeves theorized that the perpetrator or perpetrators had intercepted the buses somehow, perhaps by impersonating law enforcement or camp officials, then transported the passengers to a secondary location before disposing of the vehicles in the lake. But her theory couldn't account for the physical logistics. How does one move 12 terrified teenagers and a full-grown adult without leaving witnesses or evidence? The break in the case came from an unexpected source. In November 2020, a woman named Lily Brennan contacted the tip line from her home in Oregon. Lily, now 57 years old, explained that she had been scheduled to attend Camp Riverside in June of 1989 as part of a church youth group from Casper. At the last minute, she had developed appendicitis and been hospitalized, missing the bus that carried her friends to what she had always assumed was a wonderful week at camp. She had lost touch with those friends over the years, moving away from Wyoming and building a new life. But when she saw news coverage of the second bus discovery, she recognized names on the passenger list, names of the boys and girls she had been supposed to travel with. They had never returned from camp, she realized with horror. In her child's understanding of the world, she had simply thought they had moved away or changed schools. The adults in her life, consumed by their own problems, had never explained what happened. Lily's testimony opened a new avenue of investigation. Detectives tracked down other individuals who had been connected to the 1989 group, including a youth pastor named Robert Hastings, who had organized the camp trip. Hastings, now in his 70s and suffering from early-stage dementia, recalled with frustrating vagueness that there had been some kind of confusion about the trip. He thought the children had arrived safely at camp, he said, because he had received a call from someone claiming to be the camp director, confirming their arrival. But he couldn't remember any details about the call, and there were no records to corroborate it. Had someone impersonated camp officials to buy time before the disappearance was noticed? The theory fit with Reeves's profile, but once again, proof remained elusive. As winter settled over Wyoming in late 2020, the lake continued to recede. Water levels dropped another 6 feet by January 2021, exposing more of the northern shoreline and the geological formations that investigators had identified in their sonar surveys. A team of specialized cave divers volunteered to explore the underwater sinkhole system, hoping to find evidence or remains that had been pulled into the voids over the years. What they discovered instead was a narrow passage leading from one of the larger sinkholes to a smaller chamber. And in that chamber, protected from currents and scavengers, they found a waterproof bag containing documents. The papers inside had been sealed in plastic, and while water had seeped in around the edges, much of the text remained legible. The documents were personal letters, written by hand on notebook paper. The handwriting analysis later confirmed that they had been written by several different individuals, and the content was devastating. They were goodbye messages from the 1989 passengers addressed to parents and siblings, apologizing for something that wasn't their fault and expressing love in the desperate language of children who knew they were going to die. One letter, written by a 14-year-old girl named Rebecca Stillwater, described being held in a dark place with the others, cold and hungry, listening to someone who wouldn't show his face tell them that they were part of something important, that their sacrifice meant something. The letter ended mid-sentence, the final words trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. The discovery of the letters transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into a confirmed homicide inquiry, even though no bodies had been found. The FBI elevated the case to a major priority, assigning a task force of 12 agents to work full-time on identifying suspects and establishing timelines. They focused particularly on anyone who had worked at or been associated with Camp Riverside during both 1989 and 1996, cross-referencing employment records with criminal databases and psychological profiles. The list of potential suspects narrowed to 3 individuals: a maintenance worker who had been employed at the camp intermittently from 1985 to 1998, a local outfitter who provided equipment rentals and had access to boats capable of reaching the deep sections of the lake, and a former Natrona County Sheriff's deputy who had been dismissed from the force in 1987 for undisclosed disciplinary reasons. Each suspect had opportunity and some degree of access, but the evidence remained frustratingly circumstantial. The maintenance worker, Gerald Stokes, had died in 2015 of liver failure, leaving behind no confession or diary. The outfitter, Thomas Grayson, vehemently denied any involvement and agreed to a polygraph test that he passed, though investigators noted that psychopaths often beat such tests. The former deputy, a man named Frank Cordell, had moved to Alaska in 2001 and was initially unreachable. When agents finally located him in a remote fishing village, he refused to speak with them without an attorney present. His lawyer, sensing the weakness of the case, advised complete silence, and without physical evidence tying Cordell to the crimes, prosecutors couldn't move forward with charges. The frustration of being so close yet unable to achieve justice wore on everyone involved. Patricia Fletcher's health began to deteriorate, the stress of renewed hope and crushing disappointment taking a physical toll. She was hospitalized in March 2021 with a minor stroke, and her doctor warned her that continuing to immerse herself in the investigation would likely cost her the few remaining years she had. But Patricia couldn't let go. She had spent half her life searching for answers, and now, with confirmation that the children had been taken deliberately, with letters proving they had been alive after the buses disappeared, she felt she owed it to Kimberly to see the case through to its conclusion. In April 2021, agents received an unexpected break from an entirely different case. Frank Cordell's name appeared in connection with a cold case from Montana involving the disappearance of 2 hikers in 1994. The hikers had been found dead months after their disappearance, their bodies showing signs of captivity and exposure. At the time, the murders had been attributed to a transient drifter who died in a shootout with police before he could be tried. But new DNA evidence collected from beneath the female hiker's fingernails didn't match the drifter. It matched genetic material from a half-brother of Frank Cordell, a man named Dennis Cordell, who had died in a prison riot in 1999. The connection was tenuous, but it gave investigators probable cause to obtain search warrants for Frank's property in Alaska and his former residence in Wyoming, which had been sold but still contained items stored in a detached garage. The search of the Alaska property yielded nothing of value, but the Wyoming garage, now owned by a ranching family who had never bothered to clear out the previous owner's belongings, contained boxes of personal effects that Frank had abandoned when he moved north. Buried in a box of old tax records and utility bills, agents found a spiral notebook containing what appeared to be planning notes. The handwriting matched Frank's, and the dates corresponded to May and June of 1989. The notes were cryptic, filled with references to deliveries and lake processing, and a series of numbers that eventually were decoded as coordinates that marked the location where the first bus had been found. The notebook also contained a chilling passage that read, "12 is the right number. Tested in 89, will confirm in 96. Departure must be Sunday, late afternoon. CR staff departure is Saturday night, gives 48 hours before alarm. Lake depth sufficient at northwest quadrant, verified by sonar rental under false name." The implications were staggering. Frank Cordell had not only planned the 1989 disappearance, he had also anticipated and executed the 1996 incident as some kind of confirmation or continuation of his earlier crime. But the notes offered no explanation for motive, no indication of what he had done with the victims or why he had chosen these particular targets. Armed with this evidence, prosecutors in Wyoming filed murder charges against Frank Cordell in May 2021. His attorney attempted to suppress the notebook, arguing that it had been obtained from a property he no longer owned, but the judge ruled that Frank's abandonment of the items constituted a relinquishment of any expectation of privacy. Still, the case against him remained largely circumstantial. Without bodies, without witnesses, without a clear motive or confession, the prosecution faced an uphill battle. They assembled a team of experts to present the evidence, forensic linguists who analyzed the notebook's handwriting and language patterns, psychologists who profiled Cordell as a methodical, organized offender capable of long-term planning, and timeline specialists who demonstrated that he had been in Wyoming during both disappearances. The trial began in September 2021 in a Casper courtroom, filled to capacity with family members, journalists, and curious spectators. Frank Cordell, now 73 years old, sat impassively through weeks of testimony, showing no emotion as prosecutors described the terror his victims must have experienced. His defense attorney argued that the notebook was nothing more than creative writing, that Frank had always harbored ambitions of becoming a crime novelist and had simply been sketching out fictional scenarios. The coordinates, the defense claimed, were coincidental. Frank had been an avid fisherman who kept detailed records of productive fishing spots around Lake Alturas. But the prosecution's case gained strength when they called Catherine Reeves to the stand. The retired profiler walked the jury through her analysis, explaining how the crimes bore all the hallmarks of a perpetrator with law enforcement training, someone who understood how jurisdictional boundaries and bureaucratic inefficiencies could be exploited. She noted that Frank's dismissal from the sheriff's department in 1987 coincided with complaints about his excessive interest in unsupervised contact with teenagers during community outreach programs. She described a personality type that derived satisfaction not from the acts themselves necessarily, but from the power of having orchestrated something so complex that it had remained unsolved for decades. The jury listened in rapt attention as she connected the psychological dots. The letters found in the underwater chamber proved to be the prosecution's most powerful evidence. Handwriting experts confirmed that they had been written by several of the 1989 victims, and their content, particularly Rebecca Stillwater's description of a captor who wouldn't show his face, aligned with the prosecution's theory that Frank had used his law enforcement credentials to gain initial compliance before revealing his true intentions. The defense couldn't adequately explain how Frank's coordinates had led to the discovery of buses connected to letters written by the victims. The coincidences piled up like snowdrifts until the defense's alternative explanations seemed willfully blind. After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on 24 counts of first-degree murder. Frank Cordell showed no reaction as the verdict was read, his face as blank as it had been throughout the trial. But in the gallery, Patricia Fletcher collapsed into sobs, supported by other family members who had waited 25 years for this moment. It wasn't the complete answer they had hoped for. Frank never explained what he had done with the bodies or why he had committed the crimes, but it was justice of a sort, an acknowledgement that their children had been real, their disappearances had been crimes, and someone would be held accountable. The sentencing hearing in October 2021 gave the families an opportunity to address Frank directly. One by one, they stood and spoke about the children who had been taken from them, the decades of grief and uncertainty, the graduations and weddings and grandchildren that would never exist. Daniel Zimmerman's sister, now in her 60s, held up a photograph of her brother and demanded that Frank tell them where the bodies were buried, where they could finally lay their loved ones to rest. Frank sat in silence, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. The judge sentenced him to 24 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would die in prison regardless of any future appeals. Patricia Fletcher visited Lake Alturas one final time in November 2021, on what would have been Kimberly's 40th birthday. The drought had continued to drain the reservoir, and the water level now sat nearly 60 feet below its historical maximum. She stood on the exposed lakebed near where the buses had been found, running her fingers through the dried mud and wondering if she was touching ground her daughter had once touched. The lake had given up its secrets reluctantly, revealing the truth only when climate and chance aligned to pull back its watery veil. She thought about all the other lakes and reservoirs across the American West, shrinking under the relentless pressure of drought, and wondered what other stories might be waiting at the bottom, what other families might still be searching for answers that rested just out of sight beneath the surface. In the months following the trial, investigators continued to search for the victims' remains. They drained sections of the lake, excavated the sinkholes, and searched properties that Frank had owned or frequented during the relevant periods. But as of late 2021, no bodies had been recovered. The prevailing theory was that Frank had disposed of them in a location far from Lake Alturas, perhaps in the mountains or on federal land where they might never be found. The buses, it seemed, had been nothing more than elaborate misdirection, a way to focus the investigation on the lake while the actual evidence lay elsewhere. It was a final cruelty from a man who had built his entire scheme on layers of deception and misdirection. The families established a memorial near the lake's northern shore, a simple stone marker listing the names of all 24 victims. Every June, on the anniversary of the first disappearance, they gathered to remember the children who boarded buses expecting adventure and instead met something far darker. The memorial has become a place of pilgrimage for true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators, people drawn to the mystery even though the criminal has been caught and convicted. What continues to haunt everyone who encounters the story is the question of motive, the why that Frank Cordell took to his grave when he died of a heart attack in prison in March 2023, just 18 months into his sentence. Patricia Fletcher outlived him by only a few months, passing away in her sleep in July 2023 at the age of 71. Her obituary noted that she was finally reunited with her daughter Kimberly, a sentiment that brought comfort to those who believed in such reunions and hollow ache to those who didn't. She had spent her final years writing a book about the case, a mother's account of the search for justice that remained unpublished at the time of her death. Her surviving family members worked with a small press to release it posthumously in 2024, titling it "The Lakebeds Give Up Their Secrets," and all proceeds went to organizations supporting families of missing persons. Lake Alturas continues to recede, its shoreline retreating year by year as the drought persists into its second decade. Scientists predict that if current trends continue, the reservoir could shrink to a fraction of its former size by 2030, exposing landscapes that have been underwater for more than half a century. Sometimes, standing on the shore and looking out at the diminished water, visitors report a strange feeling, as if the lake is watching them, as if it holds other secrets that it will reveal only when it's ready. The buses are gone now, cut up for scrap metal and analysis, but their ghosts linger in the public imagination, yellow hulks resting in the deep, waiting for the water to fall away and expose them to the light they should have seen decades earlier. For the families, closure remains incomplete. They have a conviction, they have confirmation that their loved ones were murdered, but they don't have the remains that would allow for proper burial and the psychological finality that comes with it. They continue to pressure authorities to search, to follow up on tips, to use new technology as it becomes available. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs trained for aged remains, even experimental DNA sampling from soil. Every new technique offers a glimmer of hope that this might be the year the children come home. But as time passes and Frank's secrets remain locked in death, that hope dims like sunset on the prairie, beautiful and heartbreaking and always moving just out of reach. The story of the 12 campers who vanished in 1996 and the 12 who vanished 7 years before them has become part of Wyoming's dark folklore, whispered around campfires and recounted in late-night conversations about the nature of evil. It serves as a reminder that the vast landscapes of the American West, for all their beauty and promise, can also conceal horrors. That the same emptiness that draws people seeking freedom and adventure can be weaponized by those who understand how to exploit isolation and distance. The buses emerging from the lakebed after 24 years felt like resurrection, like the earth itself demanding that the truth be told. But the truth, when it finally arrived, brought less peace than anyone had hoped, proving once again that some questions have answers that satisfy the mind without healing the heart.